The sun rose over the distant red mountains of Dorne, painting the sky in shades of pale gold and soft rose as the morning light spread across the desert. A dry breeze whispered along the cracked earth and stirred the spiky branches of cacti and scrub brush that clung to life in that arid land. For Lyanna, the dawn had become a daily ritual she welcomed with a mixture of apprehension and hope. She had grown accustomed to these quiet beginnings, when the world remained hushed and she could almost pretend she was safe. The day's relentless heat had yet to mount its siege. It was a time of fragile beauty when the desert seemed almost merciful. In this new existence, she went by the name Elia Sand, a half-truth, if ever there was one. Dorne had more than its share of bastards named Sand, and the name served as a shield for her hidden identity. Of course, the greatest secret lay sleeping in a small cradle just inside the sandstone cottage she'd made her home. She had woven countless lies and half-lies around herself and the boy, ensuring no rumor could trace back to the north or to the Stormlands or anywhere else. No one must suspect that the woman who lingered in this remote corner of Dorne was, in fact, Lyanna Stark, the sister of the new Warden of the North, and that the baby boy so peacefully at rest within was not simply her child, but also the son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne. She closed her eyes against the warm light and breathed in the desert's dusty scent. She had never imagined she would spend her life here, of all places, far from the snows of Winterfell and the green rolling hills of the Riverlands that she had once galloped through. The memories of home had softened over time, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Perhaps, she told herself, this was a fitting place of exile. There was a certain beauty in Dorne, a fierce independence she admired in its people, in how they carried themselves despite the harsh sun and the storms that sometimes battered the coast. She told herself she could live with the ache of distant winter in her heart, so long as her son was safe. She called him Jon. To all the curious eyes of her small settlement, he was Jon Sand, her Trueborn son, or so she allowed them to think. She had managed to persuade the local septa that he was born within wedlock to a father who died under mysterious circumstances. She had spun a tale of sadness and wandering, and eventually found refuge in this tiny hamlet, nestled between dusty hills and sharp outcroppings of rock. The villagers had no interest in her complicated past. They only saw a quiet, fair-skinned woman of northern features that, once explained as the heritage of some lesser-known knight, attracted little attention. They had problems of their own, disputes over water rights, the arrival of traveling merchants and possible bandits on the horizon. No one truly cared to pry into her life, and that suited her well. She tiptoed into the single-room cottage. It was modest, with walls of thick adobe to keep out the heat, and few furnishings beyond a low wooden table, a couple of stools, and the narrow bed tucked against the back wall. The cradle was set by the corner near the single window, shaded by a piece of cloth that fluttered with every shift of the breeze. There he slept, black curls dusting his forehead, little fists clenched, oblivious to the world's dangers. Watching him, Lyanna felt that same fierce protectiveness she had felt the day he was born. That day she thought she might lose her life for his to begin. She gazed at him as if her eyes alone could shield him. Ever so gently, she brushed her fingertips over his cheek. He stirred, then let out a soft sigh, drifting into deeper sleep. She longed to hold him, to whisper the truth in his ear, that he was no bastard at all, but the rightful heir to the Iron Throne by birth. Of course, that was a claim she neither wanted nor dared to assert, claiming it would bring a storm of swords and vengeance upon them both, for Robert Baratheon now wore the crown, and in his eyes, the Targaryen line was an abomination. Lyanna refused to see her child become a rallying cry for some war. She refused to let the realm tear him apart. So she had carved out this quiet life in Dorne, letting the illusions protect them. A faint knock came at the wooden door. Lyanna drew her cloak over her shoulders, suddenly conscious of her face, though no one had ever recognized her. She silently crossed the floor, pressed a hand against the door, and listened. Outside stood a neighbor, Aphra, a woman of middle age with a worn face from too many seasons of scorching sun. Aphra was kind enough, always eager to share a bit of gossip or a handful of fresh olives from her orchard. Lyanna opened the door slowly, offering a subdued smile. Ephra peered past her, curious as ever, but only saw the small shape of the cradle in the corner. "Morning, Nalia," Ephra greeted, ignoring the formality of knocking once she noticed the door was ajar. "I came to see if you'd be attending the market today. The traveling merchants are in town, and they've got fruit from the coastal orchards. Thought you might fancy some apples." Lyanna hesitated. She rarely ventured too far from the cottage with John, but they did need provisions, and the local orchard didn't always have the variety or quality of fruit that a traveling merchant might carry. She tried to remember that the more she resisted going into town, the more suspicious it might seem. She forced a small, polite smile. "Yes, I think we should go. I wouldn't mind a bushel of apples, especially if they're fresh. Let me gather a few things. We'll come along with you." Ephra clapped her hands with delight and looked over Lyanna's shoulder again. "We'll have a proper mother and child day, we will." "Will John be joining us?" "He's getting bigger by the week." Lyanna nodded, then glanced back at the cradle. "I'll wrap him up against the sun and carry him in my sling. It's safer that way. You never know who's passing through, though it's probably nothing. I'll just be a moment." Ephra gave a kindly shrug, as if to say who would bother them out here. "I'll wait outside," she replied, already taking a few steps back. Lyanna quietly closed the door and turned to see John awake, stirring, making that soft whimpering sound that demanded comfort. She gently lifted him from the cradle, kissed his forehead, and began the process of preparing him for the journey into the village, ensuring he wore a tiny hat for shade, checking that his light garments covered his fair skin, then tying the simple sling around her torso so she could support him against her chest. It was a routine that had become second nature. As they set off, Lyanna felt the desert's heat pressing down, though the early morning sun still held a tolerable warmth. Ephra walked alongside her, chattering happily about how her sister's daughter was courting a sellsword from the free cities, about how there was talk of trouble in the west with outlaws crossing the border, and about how the local orchard had been threatened by a lack of rainfall. Lyanna nodded politely, interjecting where needed, but for the most part, let Ephra ramble on. She had learned that blending in sometimes meant being a good listener. People spoke freely around her, trusting in her reticence. A narrow dirt path led them toward the settlement. A scattering of sandstone houses with red-tiled roofs, built around a dusty courtyard that served as a makeshift market square. A single large well was situated at the center, and around it, the traveling merchants had set up wooden stalls, or spread cloth on the ground to display their wares. Lyanna saw barrels of fruit, racks of spices, clay jugs of olive oil, earthenware cups and plates. Further down, a cloth merchant called out his goods, his voice echoing against the sun-bleached walls. Men and women wove between the stalls, some haggling, others chatting with old friends, some simply wandering to pass the time. She felt a nudge from Ephra, who smiled. "Go on, have a look. I see a stall with apples there." The older woman drifted away to greet the cloth merchant, leaving Lyanna to navigate the crowd. John wriggled in the sling, his wide gray eyes scanning the bustling scene. He made a small cooing sound, and Lyanna gently rocked him. She marveled at how her child didn't cry in the face of new sights and sounds. He was curious, always scanning the world around him. She silently wondered if that was the dragon blood in him, the Targaryen inheritance, a thirst to see and learn. Her heart tightened at the thought of Rhaegar, who had possessed the same studious air. But she shook off the memory, pushing aside the pang of grief. She approached the fruit stall. A leathery-faced man with a patch over one eye beckoned her closer. "Fresh apples from the Greenblood region, my lady," he exclaimed with enthusiasm that surprised her. He held up a gleaming red apple, just 2 copper coins each. She examined the fruit with keen interest, pressing a fingertip against its surface. It felt firm, unblemished, and she could tell from the gentle fragrance that it was indeed fresh. She reached into a small pouch at her side and fished out a handful of coppers. "I'll take 6, she said softly. As she made her purchase, a sudden hush seemed to sweep through the crowd. She felt it on the back of her neck before she understood what had changed. The merchants' calls lowered in volume, casual conversations tapered off, and all around, a hush of curiosity or apprehension took hold. Lyanna glanced over her shoulder, keeping her movements calm, though her heart had already kicked up its pace. A group of riders had entered the courtyard. Their horses, strong and well-fed, kicked up dusty clouds. These men did not bear the usual mismatched armor of sellswords or of the tattered clothing of bandits. They wore polished leather, some with the seven-pointed star stitched onto their doublets, others with no clear sigil. Could they be soldiers of some local lord? Or perhaps more dangerous, men of the crown scouring the countryside for Targaryen loyalists? Lyanna resisted an urge to flee. Flight would only draw suspicion. She carefully turned back to the fruit vendor, handing him the coins. He took them slowly, his eyes drifting away as he too watched the riders. A tall man, at the head of the group, dismounted. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, and he had a stern expression that was accentuated by a neatly trimmed beard. With a single glance around the courtyard, he commanded attention, exuding the sort of authority that made people step back. Lyanna noted that a second man with a fierce scar on his cheek dismounted beside him. They wore no clear house sigils, but there was something official about them, an energy that told her they were here for more than buying fruit. Jon squirmed again, sensing his mother's tension, and let out a small whine. The tall man's gaze swept over the merchants, and he began to speak. "We come on behalf of Lord Ormond Ronwood," he announced, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We are searching for a band of outlaws rumored to be moving through these parts, men who have stolen from travelers and sought to stir trouble in our lord's domain. If any of you have information, speak now." There was a collective exhale of relief from the crowd. They weren't searching for Targaryens or runaways, at least not openly. Several voices rose at once, merchants offering half-remembered sightings, bits of gossip, or vague recollections of men with swords passing through. The tall man's companion jotted down notes on a scrap of parchment. Lyanna quietly thanked the fruit vendor, tucked her apples into a small cloth sack, and slipped away from the stall. She kept her gaze modestly down, as she had learned to do, to avoid attracting attention. Ephra appeared at her side, her voice low. "You see that? That's Sir Joffrey Ferris, a sworn sword of Ronwood. He's known to be a fair but firm sort. Hope he finds whoever he's looking for quickly, and moves on." She studied Lyanna's expression. "You look uneasy, dear." Lyanna forced a nod and gave a faint shrug. "I'm just not used to armed men passing through. My boy." She let the sentence trail off, letting Ephra fill in the rest. The older woman patted her shoulders sympathetically. "It's all right, child. You're safe. If you've nothing to hide, these men won't bother you." For a heartbeat, Lyanna wanted to laugh at the impossibility of that statement, but she kept her composure, giving Ephra a grateful look. "I know," she whispered. She forced herself to stand there as the soldiers continued to question the villagers. Some of them poked through sacks and crates, presumably checking for contraband. This was all normal procedure in a land troubled by outlaws. Yet it made her stomach twist in knots. Though Robert's rebellion had ended a year ago, though King Robert himself sat the throne, there were still enough Targaryen loyalists scattered across the land that the new regime occasionally sent out search parties. Even if these men were not from the crown, a single rumor about a fair northern woman with a black-haired baby might spark curiosity. She wished they would ride away. Soon enough, the men seemed satisfied with the villagers' answers or lack thereof. They discussed something among themselves in hushed tones. Then Sir Joffrey turned to address the crowd once again. "We'll remain in the region for a few days. If you see anything suspicious, come to us. We're camped by the old watchtower on the hill, that is all." With that, they mounted their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving the villagers sighing in relief. The daily routine resumed. A child's wailing punctured the hush. A vendor resumed her hawking of spices, and people went about their business, though the atmosphere was not as light as before. Lyanna glanced at Ephra, who clucked her tongue. "Well, that's that, I suppose. Let's go. I want to look at that cloth merchant's wares. Maybe we'll find something pretty for you or a new blanket for Jon." Despite her unease, Lyanna followed her. She wanted to act as though nothing had changed, as though she were but another Dornish peasant woman concerned with ordinary things. As she browsed the different bolts of cloth, she realized how close she had come to panic. Jon pressed his cheek against her, calm again, though his fingers still gripped her tunic. She stroked his hair, drawing strength from the weight of him against her. She had done this for a year, shielded him, hidden him, and she would do it for as long as necessary. That evening, she carried Jon home, the sun setting behind the mountains, the sky lit with a fiery display of reds and oranges. The desert often repaid the day's punishing heat with a stunning show at dusk, as though to remind the dwellers of its dual nature, fearsome and beautiful. Lyanna prepared a small meal of flatbread and goat cheese for herself, while Jon dozed fitfully, fussing every so often until she rocked him back to sleep. When the night breeze crept in, it was surprisingly cool. She lit a small candle, the flame dancing against the adobe walls. She thought about the day, about the nights and their searching eyes, and how her heart had pounded with fear that they might see a hint of her true identity. In times like these, she clung to a memory, her brother Ned's face solemn and loving, as he bent over her on that day of blood and tears at the Tower of Joy. He had promised to protect her son, had sworn to guard Jon's secret. That day, she believed she was dying, and in her last strength, she had forced Ned to swear the oath that this child, Rhaegar's child, would never be thrown to the wolves of Robert's hatred. But then the miracle happened. She survived. Weak, feverish, near death for weeks but alive. And in that fragile window of escape, she and Ned had concluded that it would be safer for everyone if the realm believed her dead. So Ned had returned to the north with a bundle supposedly containing the bones of his beloved sister. Word was spread that Lyanna Stark died in childbirth. He never elaborated further. As for the infant, well, people said Ned had brought home a bastard. They called him Jon Snow. But that was a ruse, for Ned concealed the truth. In reality, Lyanna had slipped away, traveling under a new name, with the help of a few loyal men who wanted to honor Rhaegar's last wish, to protect his heir. To keep her safe from further suspicion, Ned arranged for her to settle in a small village in the Dornish marches. She had since moved deeper into Dorne, further from prying eyes, and for a long while, she had been alone. Her thoughts spiraled every night, weaving regrets and hopes, wondering if it would have been better to trust in Ned alone. But she could not bear to let her child be raised without her. And no matter what hardships or lonely nights she endured, she never regretted keeping Jon close. After feeding Jon and coaxing him to nurse, she rocked him gently until he fell into a peaceful slumber. Then she placed him in his cradle and slipped onto her own narrow bed, exhaustion pulling at her. The desert nights could be eerily silent, and she would often lie awake, listening to the faint hiss of wind against the cottage walls, haunted by ghosts of what might have been. She imagined her father, Rickard Stark, disapproving from whatever afterlife existed. She pictured Robert's face twisted in betrayal, the boyish grin she once admired, replaced by cold, vengeful rage. She heard the faint echo of Rhaegar's voice, a gentle, melodic tone that had once captivated her. She pressed the heels of her palms to her eyes, as though to blot out the memories, but they persisted. Still, she breathed deep, the musk of desert dust filling her nostrils, and eventually, she drifted off into uneasy sleep. At dawn, she awoke to Jon's cries and tended to him as she did every day. She dressed, ate a quick meal, and decided to wander outside to gather any herbs that might be growing near the small stream beyond the hamlet. She had discovered a knack for remedies and potions, taught to her by an old midwife who passed through months ago. Over time, she had become the local resource for simple salves to soothe fevers or compresses to reduce swelling. She never claimed expertise, but people did come to trust her. In a place with few maesters, even rudimentary knowledge was prized. It gave her a small sense of worth, a way to repay the villagers' acceptance. She wrapped Jon against her chest again and stepped into the morning light, scanning for Ephra, who often joined her on these herb-gathering walks. But the older woman was nowhere in sight. Likely she was tending to her orchard or simply slept in. Lyanna took a winding path around the back of the cottage, climbing a gentle slope until she reached a small plateau. From there she could see the entire hamlet stretched out below, with wisps of chimney smoke rising into the air. She could also see the watchtower on the opposite hill. The Ironwood men were probably camped there still, scanning for trouble. She prayed they would soon decide there was nothing of interest and depart. A patch of scrubby sage grew near a cluster of large boulders. Lyanna knelt, balancing Jon carefully, and used a small knife to cut the healthier stems. The desert morning was quiet, save for the distant caw of a bird of prey. She felt herself beginning to relax, soothed by the repetitive snip of her knife and the crisp, clean smell of the sage. She carefully stored the herbs in a cloth pouch slung over her shoulder. Jon cooed softly, reaching out with pudgy fingers as if to grasp the knife or the leaves, his natural curiosity shining bright. She smiled at him, tapped his little hand and said, "Patience, little one. One day, I'll teach you how to do all of this yourself." The thought brought warmth to her heart, envisioning a future where Jon could grow up free from the burden of his parentage, free from the fear that had defined so much of her life lately. She stood and continued along a faint trail that led to the stream. The land sloped downward into a shallow ravine where water trickled, never enough to fill a river, but enough to keep the settlement from thirst. She found a few more herbs along the banks, plucking them and adding them to her pouch. As she did, she let her thoughts wander, constructing a life for Jon in her mind. He would learn to ride, though not at the breakneck pace she had once favored as a girl. He would learn to read, to appreciate the histories, to speak the truth when it mattered. She pictured him growing tall, strong, with that calm intensity already visible in his inquisitive eyes. Then, a muffled sound came from behind her, a scraping of boot against rock. Lyanna's heart jumped, and she spun around, clutching Jon protectively. Through the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement at the top of the ravine. Her first thought was that it might be one of the Ironwood knights, or even a passing traveler. Her mind raced, searching for an escape route, or a place to hide if needed. But her fear slowly ebbed when she saw who it was. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s, wearing worn leathers and carrying a small satchel at his side. He had a friendly, open face marred by a trace of tiredness, as if he'd been walking a long while. He hesitated upon seeing her, then lifted a hand in greeting. "7 blessings," he called. "I didn't mean to startle you." Lyanna did not loosen her protective grip on Jon, but she nodded, affecting the polite distance of strangers in the wilderness. "The same to you. Are you lost?" She kept her tone neutral. He shook his head. "I've been traveling south from Blackhaven, crossing into Dorne, hoping to reach the Greenblood before heading east. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere." He scratched the back of his neck in embarrassment. "I heard there's a settlement nearby. Is that where you're from?" She studied him. His accent bore a slight Stormlands lilt, which set her nerves on edge. She had spent years around Robert Baratheon and others from that region, and her mind flicked to the possibility that this man could be someone who had once seen her. But it seemed unlikely. She had rarely spent time around small folk or traveling men. Still, she was cautious. "Yes, there's a village over that ridge." She inclined her head. "You shouldn't have trouble finding it." He nodded with relief. "Thank you. I'll keep going then." He was about to turn away but paused, glancing at the baby. "Your child is beautiful. I don't mean any intrusion, but congratulations." She stiffened, forcing a tight smile. "Thank you." She wondered if the black hair would make him think of the Starks or the Targaryens. Even if it did, that alone meant nothing. Still, she felt a simmering anxiety. He seemed harmless enough, but she had learned never to drop her guard. He lifted a hand in parting. "Good day then, my lady." With that, he trudged back up the ravine, disappearing from sight. Lyanna released a silent breath. Dorne was filled with wanderers and travelers from across the 7 kingdoms. She reminded herself there was no reason to suspect every stranger of posing a threat. Still, she felt the weight of her secret more heavily than ever. She realized that the small hamlet was becoming less isolated lately. More travelers meant more risk. She turned back to the stream, her heart still pounding. Jon fussed, perhaps sensing her tension. She gently rubbed his back, murmuring reassurances. "It's all right, sweet boy," she whispered. "We'll be fine." Yet, as she spoke, a little voice in her mind whispered doubt. How long could they keep this up? She had chosen this life of quiet exile, but the world outside was vast and unpredictable. A single rumor, a single slip, and they would be in danger again. For now, though, there was nothing to do but return to the cottage and carry on with her day. She made her way back to the slope, gathering her wits, reminding herself that the best disguise was ordinary routine. She could not barricade herself inside forever. That would only spark more curiosity. By the time the sun hung high overhead, Lyanna was back in the hamlet. A few children dashed by, giggling and shouting, playing a game of chase. A donkey brayed in the distance. She passed Ephra's orchard, where the older woman was busily checking the fruit, likely cursing the dryness of the soil. Nearby, a farmer hammered away at a broken cart wheel. Everything looked peaceful, serene, like 1,000 other villages across the kingdoms. Inside her cottage, she laid John down for a midday nap and set about preparing the herbs she had gathered, tying them in small bundles to dry or crushing them into paste to store in tiny clay pots. She found solace in the simple, repetitive tasks. The sound of the mortar and pestle was almost meditative. She hummed softly under her breath, a lullaby she used to sing to John. Her mother once sang it to her. It was a northern tune, its gentle rhythm calling up images of snowy forests and gray walls of stone. She wondered if John would ever see Winterfell, or if she would ever risk venturing that far north again. A part of her ached too. She missed her brothers, Ned and Benjen. She missed her sister-in-law, Caitlin, even though they hardly knew each other. She missed the comfort of home. But she pressed those feelings down, reminding herself there was no going back. Not yet. She was still grinding herbs when Ephra arrived at her door, letting herself in with a casual rap on the wood. Lyanna looked up to see the older woman standing there, a worried twist to her mouth. "Elia dear, I thought you should know. Those Euronwood knights are sticking around longer than expected. They've been asking the villagers questions." She paused, scanning Lyanna's face. "Don't worry. They haven't asked about you specifically. They seem more concerned with these outlaws. But I thought you'd want to know, seeing as you've a child to look after. You might want to be careful." "No. Lyanna set down the pestle. "Thank you, Ephra. I appreciate the warning." She swallowed, trying to keep her composure. I'll make sure to keep my doors locked. I doubt they'll bother with a lonely widow and her babe, but one never knows." Ephra nodded, sympathy in her gaze. "We're all looking out for you. You're one of us now." She paused a moment, her eyes drifting to John, who slept peacefully. "If you ever need anything, you come find me." A warmth spread through Lyanna's chest. She reached out, clasping Ephra's hand briefly. "I will. Thank you." And with that, the woman left, leaving Lyanna alone with the echoes of her gratitude and fear. Days turned into a week. The Euronwood men combed the area, occasionally stopping villagers in the street to ask about suspicious behavior. Reports surfaced of scattered bandits striking caravans near the Prince's Pass, but none of them seemed connected to the hamlet. Lyanna kept her life meticulously unremarkable. She continued to gather herbs in the morning and sell her small remedies in the evening. She washed clothes in the stream, bartered with neighbors for eggs, rocked John to sleep every night. A certain tension gripped the settlement, but it did not reach a breaking point. Lyanna avoided the soldiers whenever she could. When forced into proximity, she lowered her head in respectful deference. And so, she passed unnoticed. One afternoon, as the sun dipped beyond the desert hills, she found herself alone in the courtyard well, drawing water. The rope creaked with each tug, echoing in the stillness. Most villagers had already gone home to prepare their suppers. The last rays of sunlight cast long shadows on the ground. Lyanna worked quickly, eager to finish and return to the safety of her cottage. John was with Ephra, who had kindly offered to watch him for a brief spell. She had just hauled up a bucket and was bending to pour it into a clay jug when she sensed a presence behind her. She froze, the hair on her arms standing on end. Slowly, she rose and turned around. A man stood there, a soldier from the Euronwood band. Not Sir Joffrey, but the one with the scar on his cheek. She had seen him in the courtyard. He watched her with an intense gaze. "Good evening," she said softly, feigning calm. Her heart pounded in her chest. He gave a curt nod. "Evening," he replied. He stepped forward, letting her see the sword at his hip. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Her nerves flared. "May? Why would that be?" She wiped her hands on her skirt, careful to keep them from trembling. The soldier tilted his head. "We've been in this village nearly a fortnight now, and I've heard rumor of a woman named Elia Sand who came here not too long ago with a babe. Some say you arrived under mysterious circumstances. I'm curious." He let the words linger, his tone neither overtly threatening nor friendly. Lyanna's breathing shallowed. "My husband died. I had nowhere else to go," she said, voice steady as she clung to her well-rehearsed story. "I've set down roots here because the people are kind. That's all." He eyed her for a long moment. "I see. And your babe? Fathered by this husband of yours?" Her cheeks flushed with a sudden rush of anger at the implication. "Of course," she said sharply. "What are you suggesting?" The soldier shrugged. "Suggesting nothing. But we're on the hunt for outlaws, and sometimes outlaws hide among new arrivals, people no one knows much about." He stepped closer, and she could smell the leather of his jerkin. "You wouldn't be hiding anything, would you?" Her pulse hammered in her throat. She forced herself to hold his gaze. "I'm an herbalist and a mother. That is my life." She paused, letting genuine weariness seep into her tone. "I have no knowledge of outlaws or anything else." For a tense heartbeat, they stared at each other in the fading light. Then the soldier gave a single nod. "If that's the truth, I'll waste no more breath." He turned on his heel, but before he left, he glanced at her over his shoulder. "Still, I'd be careful, Elia Sand. The desert nights can hide many dangers." With that cryptic warning, he strode away. Lyanna waited until his footsteps faded before she let out a shaky exhale. She realized her hands were clenched into fists. She forced them open, feeling the sting of her nails against her palms. She gathered the water jug, trying to steady her breath, and made her way back to the cottage, each step feeling heavier than the last. Questions spun in her mind. Had he simply been suspicious of a new face? Or had he recognized something in her northern features? Could it be that her secret was already unraveling? She told herself she might be overreacting, yet doubt gnawed at her. When she arrived, Ephra was bouncing John gently on her lap, humming a cheerful tune. The infant gurgled with delight. At the sight, some of Lyanna's tension eased, replaced by a longing for normalcy. She took John into her arms and held him close. He pressed his tiny fists against her chest, looking at her with bright curiosity. In that moment, her resolve hardened. She would fight for this child, no matter what. If danger came knocking, she would run, she would hide. She would do anything to keep him safe. She kissed his forehead, inhaling the warm, powdery scent of his skin. Ephra frowned. "You look pale, child. Did something happen?" Lyanna forced a small smile, touched by the older woman's concern. "Just the heat and a little fatigue. Nothing more. Perhaps I need rest." Ephra nodded, though her expression held a hint of worry. "Of course. Take care of yourself. I'll be on my way." With a final pat to John's head, she left. Night fell, bringing the usual hush over the settlement, but Lyanna felt no serenity. She lay awake in bed, John by her side, listening intently for any sound of footsteps. Her mind reeled with possible scenarios. Perhaps the soldier's suspicions were little more than idle curiosity. He had no reason to identify her as Lyanna Stark. He had no proof. Nonetheless, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of her lie were closing in. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares of Winterfell's courtyard and men calling for her to present the Targaryen heir. She dreamt of Robert, storming through the gates with a warhammer, his face twisted in a fury that demanded blood. She jolted awake in the early hours, heart racing, breath ragged, waking John in the process. She quickly soothed him, whispering soft words, knowing that the first rays of dawn would soon crawl across the desert sand and that another day of careful caution awaited her. In the days that followed, the Euronwood nights remained. They rode out each morning, returning with varying degrees of frustration at dusk. Whatever outlaws they hunted eluded them. One evening, a small skirmish took place in the rocky canyons a few miles away. Lyanna heard rumors that 3 of the bandits were killed, but others escaped. She prayed these men would eventually disappear altogether, so the knights could return to their lord's castle. In the meantime, the soldier with the scar, whom she now knew as Sir Arwood, made a point of stopping by the well whenever Lyanna was around. He never threatened her outright, but his presence lingered like a dark cloud on the horizon. One time, he even helped her lift a heavy bucket, his face unreadable as he looked at her. She thanked him politely, said nothing more, and hurried away. The days grew hotter, the desert sun burning the land with merciless intensity. Lyanna found herself confined to the cottage for much of the afternoon, Jon in her arms, both seeking respite from the heat behind the thick adobe walls. Occasionally, she would doze off, lulled by Jon's gentle breathing, only to wake in a sweat, startled by some half-forgotten dream. Night brought only slight relief, the heat rising from the ground in shimmering waves. She told herself if she could survive the harshest winter storms in the north, she could endure this. But she did miss the crisp chill of Winterfell's breezes. Amid the tension and heat, small moments of peace stood out like precious gems. Jon's first halting steps, clutching at Lyanna's fingers as he tried to balance on wobbly legs. The laughter of neighbor children as she brought him out to play in the shade of a cactus grove. The kind remarks from the townsfolk about how he had grown so quickly, how he had his mother's stubborn spirit. Though fear was ever present in her heart, she still felt gratitude for these ordinary, wonderful moments. The stolen joys of motherhood that Robert's rebellion had nearly robbed from her. With each new sunrise, she told herself the Yronwood Knights would move on soon. She told herself that, as long as she remained careful, her secret would stay hidden. But a deep part of her wondered if the time had come to move again, to find a more remote corner of Dorne, or even the free cities across the narrow sea. Could she raise Jon as a Dornish lad, or should she uproot him to Essos? The questions nagged at her like an old wound. Eventually, whispers spread that the outlaws had drifted further west, taking advantage of the labyrinthine canyon network. And just as Lyanna had hoped, the knights prepared to depart. On a hot morning, she walked out with Jon to gather eggs from a neighbor, and she heard the distant clatter of hooves. Through the haze of dust, she glimpsed Sir Joffrey Ferris and his men leaving the watchtower. Her heart soared with relief, even as she fought to keep her face neutral. At last, she thought, they would have peace again. No more prying questions, no more watchful eyes. She noticed Sir Arwood ride at the back of the column. As he passed, he turned his head and locked eyes with her. There was no warmth in his gaze, but neither was there outright malice, just a lingering curiosity. Then he spurred his horse forward, disappearing in a swirl of dust. Lyanna stood there in the sandy courtyard, Jon on her hip, and let out a long, slow breath. Ephra approached, a wide grin on her face. "They're finally gone," she said. "I'm sure we can all breathe easier now." The older woman gently touched Jon's cheek. "He'll have an easier time of it too, won't he, precious boy?" She nodded, managing a smile. Inside, her nerves still jangled, but she allowed herself a moment of victory. Another threat had come and gone. She had managed to remain unnoticed. Another small triumph in her silent war against discovery. She took Jon's tiny hand, gave it a playful wiggle, and whispered, "Hice, my sweet boy. We're safe again, at least for now." Over the following weeks, life settled back into a quiet rhythm. Lyanna's fears did not vanish completely. She knew better than to think they ever would, but they receded to a dull ache in the back of her mind. The scorching Dornish sun marched across the sky day after day, while Jon grew steadily, learning new sounds, new expressions, even learning how to crawl faster and pull himself upright by gripping the edge of furniture. He babbled in that endearing way of infants discovering their voice, and she answered him in gentle tones, sometimes drifting into a lullaby, sometimes simply smiling and letting him explore the shapes of his world. She found herself accepted more fully into the village. Neighbors who had once kept her at arm's length now greeted her openly, asked her advice on small injuries, even shared fresh produce with her. A traveling merchant recognized her herbal remedies as a good commodity and offered to buy them in bulk, but she politely declined, not wanting to draw more attention than necessary. Still, the sense of belonging was a balm to her weary soul, and she found herself cherishing each day's small, comforting rituals. Late one evening, after the sizzling heat had surrendered to a merciful breeze, Lyanna stood outside her cottage, gazing up at the sky. The stars here were different from those of the north. They seemed sharper, more intense, perhaps because of the desert's clear air. She rocked John gently in her arms. He was nearly asleep, his eyelids fluttering as he fought the pull of slumber. She kissed his soft hair, whispering a quiet prayer to the old gods and the new higher gods. She prayed for his safety, prayed that one day he might find a purpose that brought him happiness, rather than the turmoil that had marked his coming into the world. As she stood there, the hush of the desert enveloping her, she felt a curious stir within her chest, a fragile sense of hope. She had made it a year somehow. The world believed Lyanna Stark dead. Robert Baratheon ruled from the Iron Throne. Rhaegar Targaryen's son lived in obscurity. It was not the life she had ever imagined, but it was theirs, and it was enough for now. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, no doubt. But in that moment, she allowed herself the luxury of peace. She closed her eyes, felt Jon's soft breath against her neck, and listened to the desert wind. The memory of Winterfell's wolf howls rose unbidden in her mind, yet she did not recoil from it. She embraced it, a testament to who she was and what she had survived. With each passing day, she forged a new path, not just for herself, but for the son who would forever link House Stark and House Targaryen, if only in secret. This was their shared destiny, beneath the Dornish sky, far from the power struggles and betrayals of the Iron Throne. In time, she told herself, Jon would grow strong enough to walk beside her. She would teach him what it meant to be honorable, what it meant to face the world without fear. She would show him how the desert can blossom after a rare rainfall, how even the harshest of lands holds unexpected beauty. And perhaps, in some distant future, she hardly dared imagine, she would tell him his true name, that he was not only her son, but the son of a prince who once believed in the hope of a better realm. But for now, she held him close, letting him be simply Jon, the child she loved more than life itself, her shining star in the vast Dornish night. And that, she vowed, was enough. Days flowed into weeks under the Dornish sun, each one marked by small, steady rhythms of life. The desert nights offered fleeting respite from the heat, and dawn brought again the punishing glare that bleached the horizon with merciless light. Lyanna, known to everyone simply as Elia Sand, woke with the first glimmers of morning. She carried Jon to the courtyard well, greeted neighbors with a subdued yet courteous nod, filled her water jug, and retreated to the cottage before the temperature climbed too high. The routine became as familiar as breathing. In the hush of early morning, there was a strange tranquility, even in a land so different from the snows and stark grandeur of her lost home. She often sat outside on a simple bench as the sun began its ascent. Crickets chirped in the brush, and small desert birds fluttered across the sky, silhouettes cutting against the pastel clouds. Jon would be in her lap, or resting against her hip, already squirming with the budding energy of a child who wanted to explore. At a year old, his curiosity had only grown. He had begun to crawl with fearless determination, pulling himself up on whatever sturdy surface he found. She would watch him with both pride and a flicker of anxiety. Each step toward independence meant he could wander where her watchful eyes might not follow. But each new milestone was also a testament to life and hope, something she clung to fiercely. In the village, the mood lightened now that the Yarnwood Knights had departed. Everyone seemed relieved to be rid of the daily reminders of potential violence. The outlaws, apparently, had disappeared into the labyrinthine canyons, and talk of them waned. Merchants came and went more freely, bringing everything from salted fish to bright bolts of cloth. A passing bard arrived one market day, plucking strings on a battered lute, singing stories of knights and lost princesses. Lyanna listened from the fringes, heart twinging at certain lines about star-crossed lovers and secret heirs. She told herself no one could read her thoughts, that she was just another face in the crowd. But the fear never quite dissipated. She found distraction and comfort in her herbal work. One morning, she joined Ephra on a walk to gather desert sage and other hardy plants that offered medicinal properties. They trudged along a narrow path, dust swirling around their ankles, a canvas bag slung over Lyanna's shoulder. John rode on her back in a makeshift carrier she'd fashioned from old cloth. He babbled now and then, enthralled by the rustling of tiny lizards under rocks. Ephra carried a walking stick for stability, occasionally pointing out a rare bloom or patch of succulent greenery that survived in the shade of boulders. Lyanna knelt to prune leaves, tested them between her fingers, and dropped them into the bag. The repetitive task was calming. Ephra chattered about village gossip, about how old Karl had stolen one of Jenna's goats, or how a traveling merchant had caused a small stir by overpricing his apples. All mundane concerns that shaped the villagers' days. They paused to rest near a dried-up stream. Lyanna offered water to Ephra, who took a long drink and then passed the skin back. John stirred in the carrier, fussing. Lyanna released him, letting him stand on wobbly legs with her hands braced on his shoulders. "Look at him," Ephra said with warm approval. "He'll be toddling around on his own in no time. You'll have your hands full, Elia. I hope you're ready to chase him." Lyanna managed a laugh, though anxiety lurked behind it. "He's quicker than he looks," she said, her eyes tracking Joan's small, determined movements. "I can't turn my back on him for a moment." Yet there was pride in her voice. She thought of how easily her boy might never have been, how close she herself had come to dying. This sturdy little child seemed a miracle in every sense. That night, she found herself exhausted from the heat and the hike. But she stayed up carefully, sorting the herbs she'd collected. She needed to grind some for a fever-reducing paste, needed to dry others for tea. With deft hands, she tied them in neat bundles, labeling them with small marks she'd invented to keep track. John had fallen asleep on her pallet, arms flung out at odd angles. She paused her work to admire him, letting the faint glow of the hearth play across his dark hair. A part of her wanted nothing more than to gather him in her arms, hold him close, assure him of safety forever. But she let him rest, returning her focus to the mortar and pestle. The repetitive motion soothed her. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of incoming dust storms. Such storms sometimes swept across the desert, turning the sky a murky orange-brown and scouring everything with sand. She braced the door with an extra piece of wood, remembering all too well how even a small sandstorm could fill her home with grit if she wasn't prepared. She thought again of Winterfell's snows, of how the cold had once seemed so daunting. Now, she found herself craving a single crisp winter day that might wash away the perpetual heat and dryness of this place. Morning arrived with an overcast sky, a rarity in Dorne, which gave the world a muted silver quality. The dryness in the air promised a gathering storm, though it was impossible to say if it would be dust, or if they might be blessed with rare rainfall. Lyanna decided to stay in to keep John indoors, lest the weather turn violent. She settled him on a mat with a wooden spoon and a little clay bowl. He delighted in clacking them together. She stepped outside briefly to check the sky. Scanning the horizon, her neighbor, a middle-aged man named Quent, called out from his porch. "You sense a storm coming?" he asked, shading his eyes. "I do," she answered. "The wind's changed." He nodded. "Best bar your windows. Last time we had a dust storm, took me a week to shovel the sand from my pantry." She murmured thanks for the reminder, then hurried back in to secure everything. Sure enough, by midday, the winds picked up, and an orange haze began to swallow the sun. With shutters closed and the door barred, the cottage grew dim and stuffy, but at least the worst of the dust stayed out. She lit a small lamp, the flame flickering in the sudden darkness. John whined, restless, and she soothed him with soft lullabies. The howling wind battered the cottage walls, dust swirling like wraiths outside. She kept glancing at the small cracks under the door, stuffing rags there to keep the sand from seeping through. Hours passed in that cramped, strange half-light. Lyanna felt claustrophobia tickle the edge of her mind. The storm seemed determined to rage well into the evening, rattling the shutters as if testing their resilience. To distract both herself and Jon, she retrieved a little cloth ball she had sewn and rolled it gently across the floor for him to chase. He giggled as he crawled after it, which made her smile. The noise of his laughter became a welcome counterpoint to the unsettling roar outside. When at last the winds began to subside, the day was nearly gone. She unlatched the shutters, letting in a thin beam of light, tinted ruddy by the clouded sky. Sand slid off the windowsill in a small avalanche. Outside, she could see drifts piled against houses, half burying some poor soul's cart. She imagined the entire village would be out at first light, shovels in hand, to clear pathways. For now, though, the streets were deserted, the world eerily still in the storm's aftermath. Night closed in again, warmer than before, as if the storm had retained all the day's heat and pressed it down upon the land. Lyanna set Jon in his cradle after the usual ritual of feeding, rocking, and humming. Then she sat by the door with a cup of water, gazing at the flickering lamp on the table. Memories came unbidden. She recalled the low-ceilinged chambers of Winterfell, the dancing shadows cast by torches in the great hall. She thought of the day she confronted her father in that same hall, her voice trembling with the fervor of youth, demanding more freedom, more say in her own destiny. How foolish she had been, blind to the intricate webs of power. The cost of that blindness still haunted her. Her father and brother Brandon were gone, lost to the Mad King's cruelty. Her own flight with Rhaegar had ignited the war that changed the realm forever. The guilt of it weighed on her, even though she had believed then that she was escaping a forced marriage, chasing a love that felt so true. But there was no return to that past, no unraveling of the fateful choices. All she could do was embrace the present, the child she cradled, the vow she made to keep him hidden and safe. She finished her water and tried to push the memories aside, knowing that regret was a luxury she could scarcely afford. The next morning, the village buzzed with activity as people dug out from the storm. Lyanna wrapped a cloth around her head to protect her hair from lingering dust in the air. She strapped Jon to her back and joined the communal effort, using a battered shovel to clear the entrance of her cottage, and then to help Ephra free the orchard saplings from sand drifts. The orchard had taken a beating. Some branches snapped, leaves stripped away by the wind. Ephra cursed in frustration, worrying about the harvest. Lyanna silently sympathized, remembering the far gentler storms of the north, which brought snow but seldom such raw destruction. By midday, the worst was cleared. A fine layer of grit coated everything, but the villagers shrugged and carried on. Life in Dorne demanded resilience. Lyanna found a strange kinship with this land. She too had survived storms, both literal and figurative. She too had been stripped down and battered by events far beyond her control, yet still pressed forward. There was a certain stark beauty in how the desert renewed itself after a storm, how the wind-shaped dunes rose once more in new forms. It reminded her that change was inevitable and continuous. A few days later, a caravan of traders arrived in the village, their wagons laden with oranges, pomegranates, olive oil, and bolts of dyed cloth that shimmered in the sun. They brought with them news from King's Landing, from the Westerlands, and from the Reach. Lyanna listened discreetly when villagers clustered around, hungry for gossip. She heard mention of King Robert planning a grand tourney to celebrate the anniversary of his coronation, of the Lannisters consolidating power, of Tyrell bannermen forging new alliances. Her heart pounded at the mention of King Robert, her Onatime betrothed, the man who still believed her dead. She forced a neutral expression, kept her distance. The arrival of these caravans was often cause for mild celebration in the hamlet. After all, new goods and information broke the monotony of daily struggle. She carefully selected fruit for Jon, paying a fair price for a small bundle of oranges. She had discovered that the boy adored the taste of fresh juice, smacking his lips at the first tangy splash on his tongue. As she peeled an orange for him that afternoon, the sweet fragrance filled the cottage. reminding her again of how different this life was from anything she had imagined in her youth. Growing up in the north, oranges had seemed an exotic luxury. Now they were the small pleasures she shared with her son. One day, as she was bartering with a cloth merchant, John in her arms, she felt a gentle tug on her skirt. She looked down to see a wide-eyed girl of about 6, hair braided in the Dornish style. The child pointed at John. "Is he your boy?" she asked innocently. Lyanna nodded, smiling. "He's pretty," the girl declared. "He's got eyes like my aunt used to have." Lyanna's chest tightened. John's eyes were gray, reminiscent of the Starks, though sometimes in certain light they took on a shade that might be called Targaryen violet. If one looked closely, she had noticed it once or twice. She told herself it was her imagination, or perhaps a trick of the desert sun, but the fear lingered that someone else might notice a fleeting glimmer of purple. She brushed the worry aside and smoothed John's black curls. "Yes, he has lovely eyes," she agreed softly. The little girl ran off laughing, and Lyanna let out a breath, telling herself no one would suspect. The days meandered onward. She found renewed focus in her herbal craft, building a small reputation in the village for effective remedies. It wasn't enough to earn her any real wealth, nor did she want that, but it allowed her to trade for goods and keep a decent supply of everything John might need. She gathered desert blossoms that treated coughs, a type of cactus pulp that relieved burns, a rare succulent that helped soothe fevers. Each time she discovered a new combination, she felt a flicker of pride. It also gave her a sense of control, a small domain in which she could excel, having been stripped of so many choices in life. Summer in Dorne stretched out in a long chain of scorching days and balmy nights. John began walking in halting steps, toppling into Lyanna's arms when he lost balance. The first time he crossed the room without falling, she let out a triumphant laugh that startled him so much he plopped down on his bottom. But she scooped him up, peppering kisses on his cheeks as he squealed in delight. She wished Rhaegar could see him, this child who was the living embodiment of their brief, doomed love. She wondered how the prince would have marveled at his son's first steps, or the shape of his smile. Another pang of loss settled in her chest, but she kept it buried behind a gentle smile. John's wide eyes looked up at her, trusting, as if to say that all he needed in the world was her. Not long after John took his first successful steps, another traveler arrived, a woman who went by the name Dorea. She was older, with graying hair and a shrewd gaze. She claimed to be a hedge healer of sorts, moving from village to village offering more advanced skills than typical midwives. Lyanna greeted her politely, wary of someone who might overshadow her small role in the village's healing needs. But Dorea surprised her by showing genuine warmth, asking if Lyanna might be willing to share what desert herbs she had discovered. In turn, Dorea taught her a few more complex mixtures, tinctures for deep wounds, poultices for snake bites. The two women spent an afternoon bent over clay bowls, comparing knowledge. John played with a stray cat that had wandered into the cottage, giggling as it batted at a dried cactus husk. By evening, Lyanna found she enjoyed Dorea's company. The older woman carried no sign of malice, only the weariness of a life spent on the road. Over a simple meal of bread and olives, they exchanged tales, Lyanna giving only the vaguest details of her past, Dorea recounting her experiences, patching up injuries in the Stormlands, or the Reach. When the woman asked about Lyanna's origins, she repeated her usual story. A widow from the marches come south for a fresh start. Dorea seemed to accept it without prying. That night, Dorea slept on a pallet near the fire, while Lyanna dozed uneasily with John in her arms, uncertain if trusting this stranger had been wise. Come morning, Dorea announced, she would remain for a while, tending to villagers who might need more specialized care. Lyanna watched how people responded to the new healer. They were curious, respectful, and some grateful, especially those who suffered from lingering ailments. Gradually, Lyanna realized that Dorea's presence could be a boon. Someone else to share the burden of healing, who could attract attention from farther abroad, while Lyanna focused on the more mundane tasks. Better to let the traveling healer field the big problems. That left Lyanna freer to stay quiet and unnoticed. Over time, an odd sort of camaraderie developed between them. Dorea praised Lyanna's skill at identifying desert herbs, and Lyanna listened attentively to Dorea's stories about different cures. They would trade jokes about difficult patients, one man who insisted on a cure for baldness, another who wanted a potion to make his neighbor's goats wander off. Jon, for his part, took a liking to Dorea, patting her skirts whenever she came by, giggling when she offered him a sweet date. Watching them, Lyanna felt a spark of genuine affection, the sort of maternal warmth she had not experienced since leaving Winterfell's heart. One stifling afternoon, while Jon napped, Dorea quietly mentioned that she planned to head further south in a week or two. Lyanna nodded, telling herself it was best this woman not stay forever. The longer people lingered, the more likely secrets came to light. Still, part of her would miss the companionship. Dorea eyed her, then asked, "Have you ever thought about taking your boy elsewhere? A bigger town, perhaps, where you might find more opportunities?" Lyanna felt a spike of alarm. Had Dorea sensed her hidden identity? Or was this simply innocent curiosity? She forced a light shrug. "He's just a small child, and we're doing all right here. I have enough to feed him, a roof over our heads. What more do we need?" Dorea pursed her lips, then nodded. "Fair point. Just be sure not to let your skills go to waste in a place so small. There's a wide world out there." Lyanna offered a polite smile. "Perhaps when he's older we'll see more of it." The conversation ended there, but the question lingered in Lyanna's mind. She wondered if fate would eventually force them to uproot again. For now, the hamlet felt as much like home as any place could. She pushed aside the thought and resolved to stay unless necessity demanded otherwise. That evening, a traveling minstrel joined them for supper in the open courtyard near Ephra's orchard. Torches lit the area in a soft glow, and people gathered to share food, drink, and entertainment. The minstrel strummed a lute, singing a bawdy tune that made the villagers laugh. Children danced in circles, chasing one another through the dust. Lyanna held Jon on her lap, rocking him gently, letting him watch the flicker of torchlight on the minstrel's polished instrument. Then the minstrel shifted to a slower song, one about a maiden who fell in love with a tragic prince. Lyanna's throat tightened at the lyrics. Though it was a common theme in the stories of the smallfolk, it pricked her heart like a needle. She remembered hearing Rhaegar sing softly once, in a voice that was beautiful enough to stir tears. She remembered that fateful moment when she realized he was more than the aloof prince people rumored him to be. She closed her eyes, leaning down to kiss Jon's hair. Let the song pass over her, she thought. Let it be just another tale for the crowd. When the minstrel finished, polite applause followed, and people resumed their chatter. Ephra nudged Lyanna, offering her a bowl of stewed vegetables, spiced with a bit of chili. "Eat, dear," the older woman insisted. Lyanna thanked her and took a few bites, though her appetite was faint. She watched the flickers of flame, listened to the hum of conversation, and felt both comforted by this communal warmth and haunted by a sense of always being on the outside. She was a ghost in her own life, living under a name that was not hers, her true self buried beneath a careful disguise. The next days passed uneventfully. Dorea prepared to leave, gathering her supplies in neat bundles. Lyanna helped her pack, making sure the older woman had enough waterskins for the journey. Ephra baked some travel bread. Others offered small gifts of thanks. On the morning of her departure, Dorea gave Lyanna a long, thoughtful look. "You have the heart of a healer," she said. "Not many do. If ever you find your way south near the coast, look for me in Sunspear. I might set up there for a time." Lyanna nodded, a polite smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you for the offer." "Safe travels." Dorea crouched to ruffle Jon's black curls. "Grow strong, little one," she murmured. Then she rose and set off, leading a tired mule down the dusty road. Lyanna stood in the doorway, Jon balanced on her hip, watching until the figure grew small and disappeared around a bend. A sense of relief mingled with sadness. She had grown to like Dorea, yet letting people come too close was always dangerous. Such was her life now. Summer slipped toward autumn, though in Dorne, the shift was subtle. The days grew slightly shorter, the nights a bit cooler. Lyanna took Jon on walks to gather the last of the seasonal blossoms. She discovered new patches of herbs, carefully storing them for the winter months. More travelers passed through, but none lingered. The hamlet was too small and remote to hold most people's interest. In the evenings, Lyanna would sometimes sit by the single window of her cottage, gazing out at the desert sky with John curled in her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. She found herself humming little tunes, the sort a mother might sing to a babe back in the north. She wondered if John would ever know the comfort of a wolf's howl at night, or if he would grow to love the desert's hush. He spoke his first clear words around that time, though they were garbled by his baby's tongue. He reached out for her, calling, "Mama!" The sound melted her heart, and she scooped him up, laughing softly. "Yes, my sweet boy, that's me." The ache of longing for her own mother swept over her unexpectedly, but she locked that feeling away. Joan's needs filled her world, and that was enough. One crisp evening, a small traveling troupe, 2 jugglers and a tumbler, arrived to perform for the village. They set up near the well, lighting torches and spinning them in mesmerizing arcs. Children shrieked with glee as colored ribbons whirled through the air. Lyanna stood apart from the crowd, John perched on her shoulders, his little hands gripping her hair. He giggled every time a juggler tossed a flaming torch high into the star-filled sky. The air smelled of smoke and roasted peppers from nearby cooking fires. Joy crackled in the night, and Lyanna allowed herself to bask in it. Yet her eyes kept darting around, scanning faces. Even in moments of near celebration, she remained vigilant. A young man passing through from the Reach, a weathered sellsword from the Stormlands. Any of these strangers could be the one who looked a bit too closely at her. She felt that tension coil in her gut, a constant readiness to flee if needed. But no signs of recognition crossed any face. She was just a Dornish widow, a mother with her child. Still, after a while, the strain of watchfulness pressed on her, and she excused herself from the festivities, retreating to the cottage. Night thickened. John fell asleep in her arms, exhausted from excitement. She settled him on the small bed they now shared. He had long outgrown the cradle. She then moved to the window, quietly unlatching it to let in a cool breeze. The desert beyond was painted silver by moonlight. She let her gaze wander across the stillness, pondering the forks in her path, the roads not taken. Sometimes she thought of Ned, her older brother who had quietly orchestrated her escape. She wished she could let him know she was safe, that his nephew was safe. She wondered how Ned fared as Warden of the North, if he was happy with his lady wife, if her younger brother Benjen had taken his vows with the Night's Watch. So many questions she could never voice. She sank onto the stool by the window, resting her chin on her folded arms, sleepless under the moon. Months drifted by, carrying the hamlet into a mild winter. In Dorne, winter meant only cooler nights and more tolerable days. A blessing for laborers. The orchard leaves turned brown, and Ephra pruned her trees, preparing for the next bloom. Lyanna found it easier to walk distances, the sun no longer oppressive. She ventured further afield, gathering cactus blooms where they sprouted in hidden gullies. John toddled alongside her, occasionally insisting he walk by himself on short stretches of safe ground. She kept a vigilant eye on him, her maternal instincts honed sharp. Each day he babbled more coherently, trying new words, forming short phrases. She would clap when he managed them, praising him with genuine delight. One morning, she set out with a small donkey cart to fetch supplies from the nearest larger market, a half-day's journey beyond the village. Ephra had asked her to bring back certain seeds for the orchard, and Lyanna needed a new mortar since her old one had cracked. She tucked John among blankets in the cart, holding the reins. The donkey ambled forward at a leisurely pace. The crisp air felt good on her face, and she hummed a tuneless melody under her breath. John dozed, lulled by the cart's gentle sway. The road was dusty and wound between low hills, dotted with scraggly brush. The rocky outcrops gleamed in the sunlight, a dull gold hue. Now and then, she passed another traveler, a farmer hauling produce, a pair of sisters on mules, a messenger hurrying with a small satchel. No one paid her much mind. She was just another woman with a donkey cart, her child wrapped in blankets. The normalcy of it soothed her as much as it saddened her. She had once been a high-born lady, the daughter of a lord, but that life was as distant as starlight. She reminded herself that this quiet existence was all she ever wanted now, for Joan's sake. She reached the small market town by mid-morning. A A few wooden stalls and stone buildings clustered around a dusty square. She negotiated the donkey's place among other carts, then lifted John into her arms. His eyes sparkled at the new sights. Vendors hawking fresh figs, a potter shaping clay on a wheel, goats bleating from a pen. She let him stare wide-eyed while she purchased what she needed, loading the donkey cart with sacks of flour, small bags of orchard seeds, and the new mortar she had bargained for. The potter, noticing her watchful gaze on her son, offered him a small clay figurine shaped like a donkey. John accepted it with a happy squeal, and Lyanna placed it carefully in the cart. As she was examining a stand of woven baskets, a voice called her name, or rather, her assumed name. Ilya Sand. She turned to see a familiar face. A merchant named Kala, who occasionally visited her hamlet. "Didn't expect to see you here," Kala said with a friendly grin. "Doing some trading on your own?" Lyanna nodded, returning the smile. "Just needed a few supplies. It's easier than waiting for the traveling merchants to come by." "Messinne." Kala bent to greet John, wiggling a finger at him. "And how's this little scamp? Growing like a weed, I see." John, half shy, clung to Lyanna, but offered a toothy grin. She exchanged pleasantries, learning that Kala planned to head north soon, perhaps to the Straits of Tarth. Lyanna forced a pleasant tone, hoping Kala wouldn't ask for details of her life that she couldn't provide. But Kala just chattered about the roads, the weather, a local knight's wedding celebration that might draw crowds. Eventually, they parted ways. Lyanna felt a tremor of relief. Friendliness was nice, but the risk of too many questions always loomed. After finishing her purchases, she decided to rest a moment in the shade before starting the journey home. She found a small bench near the town's well and settled John beside her. He was restless, wanting to wriggle free, so she let him toddle around the bench, keeping close watch. Nearby, a pair of guards in simple leather stood chatting, spears leaning against the well. They gave Lyanna cursory glances, but seemed uninterested. She let herself breathe, feeling the dryness in her throat. She lifted a water skin to take a sip. Then her gaze fell on a man standing by a stall selling spices. He was lean, dressed in dusty traveling clothes, and wore a broad-brimmed hat to shield himself from the sun. Something about his posture, the way he held his head, seemed oddly familiar. She narrowed her eyes, studying him more closely. Could she have met him before? Her mind raced, flipping through memories. Perhaps someone from Robert's retinue, a distant retainer of House Stark? She couldn't be sure. Abruptly, he turned, and for a split second their eyes met. She felt her stomach plunge. She didn't recognize his face in detail. He was older than she might have guessed. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a brief narrowing, as though something about her struck him too. Quickly, she averted her gaze, busying herself by picking up John and fussing with his blanket. Her heart thudded in her chest. She willed herself to calm. Many people passed through markets. The odds that he was someone from her past were slim. Still, she felt a prickle at the nape of her neck. She lifted John onto her hip and forced herself to walk calmly to her cart. The donkey snorted, impatient with waiting. Lyanna loaded John onto the seat, double-checking that everything was in order. She risked one more glance toward the spice stall. The man was gone. She exhaled, telling herself it was nothing. Even if he had recognized something about her face, it might just be a vague resemblance. She reminded herself that no one truly suspected Lyanna Stark to be alive, and even fewer would guess she was living as a mother in Dorne. Still, her nerves crackled as she guided the cart out of the market, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave quickly. The journey back took longer than she liked. Clouds gathered in the sky, threatening another dust storm, or perhaps a rare drizzle of rain. She urged the donkey on, occasionally glancing over her shoulder. The road was mostly empty, though once or twice she thought she spotted movement in the distance. A lone rider or a shape among the rocks. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination. John dozed, lulled by the cart's gentle rocking. By the time she reached the outskirts of the hamlet, her nerves were frayed, and she felt sweat trickling down her back despite the cooler air. Unloading the goods, she carried John inside and set him down. Ephra appeared, helping with the sacks of flour and seeds. "Everything goes smoothly?" the older woman asked. Lyanna managed a tight nod. "Yes, just the usual. Some new merchants in town, but nothing out of the ordinary." Ephra dabbed her brow with a cloth. "You look pale, dear. Are you unwell?" "Just tired," Lyanna said. "It was a long trip, and John didn't sleep much last night. I'll be all right." Ephra tilted her head, concern etched in her features, but she didn't press. She patted Lyanna's arm. "Why don't you rest? I'll fetch some water and brew us a bit of tea." Alone in her cottage with John, Lyanna tried to calm her racing thoughts. She told herself the man at the spice stall meant nothing. Even if he had recognized her, he would have to be very certain to make accusations. And who, in these times, had the interest or inclination to chase rumors of a dead Stark girl? Yet she couldn't shake the unease that dug into her. She glanced at John, who was clumsily trying to stack wooden blocks. His innocence steadied her. She knelt beside him, helping arrange the blocks. "We're safe here," she whispered, her voice resolute. "I won't let anything happen to us." Day after day, she scanned the horizon for any sign of that stranger or anyone else who might resemble the men from her past. But no one came. The village life carried on, worry drifting away like dust in the wind. Ephra joked about her orchard's chances of surviving the next dry spell, and the local children chased each other around the well, shouting nonsense rhymes. Lyanna found a measure of peace, telling herself once more that she was overreacting. The desert had ways of playing tricks on the mind. Perhaps the man was just a merchant. Perhaps that glint of recognition was only a momentary flicker of curiosity at a fair-skinned woman in Dorne. Yet that night, as she lay in the darkness with Jon's small hand curled around her finger, she remembered how she used to dream of riding free across the rolling green hills of the Riverlands, how she craved adventure. Now, the idea of being noticed by anyone from her past terrified her more than the fiercest storm. She had chosen this existence, built a wall of lies for Jon's sake. Perhaps the greatest irony was that the once reckless wolf girl now wanted nothing more than to remain invisible, to raise her child in quiet anonymity. In the following weeks, a sense of routine returned. Lyanna sang to Jon while stirring the stew pot, listened to Ephra's orchard woes, doled out small remedies for neighbors. Sometimes, she ventured into the courtyard at night, letting the hush of the stars calm her mind. She would gaze at the sky, remembering Winterfell's nightscape, recalling the shape of the constellations. Occasionally she told Jon little stories of direwolves and the old gods, in her own whispered words, though she never named the North. He was too young to understand. But her voice soothed him, and it comforted her too, to pass along a sliver of her heritage. And so, time meandered on. The desert wind shifted again, carrying the promise of a new season. With each passing day, Jon grew stronger, more coordinated, and more full of questions in his toddler's babble. Lyanna answered him with patient warmth, her heart brimming with a love she had never known possible. She found her own healing in that love, as though each of his smiles closed an old wound within her. Yet beneath her composed surface, the old fear remained. She had outlasted the Yronwood Knight's suspicions, the wandering outlaws, the traveling healer's curious questions. She had survived dust storms and the daily weight of secrecy. Still, she could never let her guard down entirely. She knew any day the world might intrude again, in the form of a stranger's prying gaze or a rumor drifting in from King's Landing. Until then, she resolved to savor the calm and nurture her son, this child who bridged worlds. She would teach him kindness, courage, and the quiet dignity she had come to respect in Dorne's people. At dusk, she walked along the edge of the hamlet, Jon's hand clasped in hers, the horizon painted in violet and crimson. They watched the sun sink behind the jagged hills, the air growing still and warm. Sand crunched beneath their feet, and a faint breeze stirred stray locks of Jon's hair. He pointed at the sky, babbling something that sounded like awe. She knelt beside him, letting him see the first stars appear. "See," she murmured, her voice tender. "They shine on us just as they shine on the north. One day, maybe you'll see them from another place. But for now, we have each other." He blinked, then gave a little nod, as though he understood. She wrapped an arm around him, and together they walked back to the cottage, guided by the glimmer of starlight on the desert sands. The hush of evening enveloped them, and for the moment, all was well in their hidden corner of Dorne. She thanked whatever gods might be listening for that small mercy. Even if her every breath carried the weight of secrecy, even if the ghost of her past sometimes loomed in her dreams, she had this, her son, her quiet life, and the promise that tomorrow would dawn with hope once more. Hey. Chai. The next day dawned beneath a hazy, pale sky, and Lyanna woke to the quiet stirring of Jon at her side, his soft breath against her shoulder. She blinked away the vestiges of sleep, sitting up slowly on the narrow bed that dominated half the cottage. The simple clay walls had grown cool overnight, and she felt a slight shiver despite the Dornish climate. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders and peered down at Jon, who blinked back, his gray eyes wide with curiosity. He seemed to sense her gaze and broke into a gurgling smile that lit up his entire face. She kissed his forehead and whispered a gentle greeting. He was still small enough to pick up easily, so she lifted him into her arms and took those first moments of the day just holding him close. She had come to treasure these silences, these intervals before the village began to bustle, and the obligations of the day pressed in. Jon babbled something, possibly trying to say her name again in his halting baby tongue. She let him explore the sounds. Sometimes even she could not fully parse his words, but the simple joy in his voice never failed to warm her heart. Outside, a rooster crowed from a neighboring coop, and through a narrow gap in the shutters, Lyanna glimpsed the pastel light creeping across the sky. She carefully set Jon on his feet, steadied him when he wobbled, and guided him to the small straw mat where his wooden blocks lay strewn. He toddled toward them, determined to begin his day's explorations. Meanwhile, she dressed in a plain linen shift and a thicker overskirt, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. As she did so, her mind turned over the tasks ahead. Collecting water, seeing if any neighbors required fresh remedies, possibly assisting Ephra in trimming damaged branches in the orchard. When she gently unbarred the door and opened it, the day greeted her with a mild breeze that stirred the fine dust on the ground. She could see the scattered houses of the hamlet laid out before her. A handful of low adobe dwellings with red-tiled roofs, the orchard beyond, and the dusty courtyard where a few children were already running. She inhaled the faint scent of warm earth. The sun had begun its climb, but the true heat would not arrive for at least another hour. Perfect time to fetch water from the well. She returned to Jon, hoisted him against her hip, then gathered up a pair of empty water jugs. He clung to her shoulder, trying to peer outside as though searching for something new every day. She smiled at his eagerness. "Let's see what the morning brings," she murmured, stepping across the threshold and making sure to close the door behind her. With patient strides, she walked the familiar path that cut between the cottages toward the central courtyard. Already a few villagers congregated there. Quent busy patching a crack in his old cart, and Marina sweeping sand from her doorstep. At the well, Ephra was filling a large bucket. She looked over with a tired smile. "Morning, Elia," she said, using the name by which everyone in the hamlet knew Lyanna. "Sleep well?" "As well as one can," Lyanna replied. She set the water jugs down carefully. "Jon's been restless, though. He kept turning over in bed last night. I think he might be on the edge of a new tooth." Ephra nodded sympathetically. "Babies always fuss when their teeth come in. Some honey water might help soothe him if he's in pain. You know where to find me if you need it." Lyanna gave a quiet laugh. "Thank you, I might take you up on that." She shifted Jon's weight and began to crank the well, listening to the creak of the rope as the bucket descended. A mild breeze ruffled her hair, bringing the taste of dust to her lips. When the bucket returned, heavy with water, she carefully filled her jugs. By the time she finished, her arms ached slightly, but it was a familiar kind of ache, the kind that came from a daily chore she was used to. Jon wriggled, pointing at the other children across the courtyard. They were chasing each other, shrieking in excitement. He made a small squeal, as if he wanted to join. Lyanna smiled. "Not yet," she told him softly. "Soon, though. Once you're steady on those feet, I'm sure you'll be running around with them." She exchanged a few more pleasantries with Ephra, then made her way back to the cottage, jugs sloshing against her legs. The day would be spent tidying, mixing a few herbal pastes, and helping Ephra in the orchard, but that felt peaceful enough. Once inside, she placed the water jugs in a shady corner and let John roam the floor while she prepared a small meal of flatbread and goat cheese. He followed her, clinging to her skirts, babbling his half-formed words. She listened with quiet amusement. In these moments, the illusions fell away, and she was simply a mother, caring for her child in the hush of a typical morning. After the meal, she wrapped John in a sling on her back, stepped outside, and crossed over to Ephra's orchard. The orchard was not large, but it provided a modest harvest of figs, olives, and a few other hardy fruits. The trees there required constant tending, especially in this unpredictable climate. Ephra was busy inspecting branches, muttering to herself. As Lyanna approached, the older woman beckoned her over and pointed at a cracked limb. "This might need a thorough pruning," she explained. "And then we'll have to see if the rest of the tree recovers." Lyanna nodded, took up a small saw, and began the careful process of trimming. John soon grew fussy, so Lyanna paused to set him down on a blanket. He toddled among the tall grass in the orchard, swaying on uncertain legs. Ephra glanced over with a grin. "He's determined, that one," she said, then lowered her voice playfully. "Probably stubborn like his mother." Lyanna pretended to roll her eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm known for my mild temperament." The two women laughed, a moment of genuine connection that felt as if it could belong to any mother and neighbor, anywhere in the realm. It was easy to forget that Lyanna hid a birthright that could provoke wars. They worked through the late morning, trimming branches and gathering the cuttings into piles. The sky remained bright, but not punishing. A slightly cooler day that allowed them to labor without feeling dizzy from the heat. Occasionally, Lyanna would pause to check on John, who watched her with bright curiosity, sometimes plucking at the grass or trying to capture a scurrying beetle. Every moment she spent with him glowed with a fragile beauty. She prayed no one would come to steal it away. As midday arrived, they retreated to Ephra's porch, seeking shade. Lyanna poured water into 2 simple clay cups, offering one to the older woman. John tugged at Lyanna's sleeve, so she tipped a small amount into a separate cup for him, letting him sip it carefully under her watchful eye. He sputtered once, coughed a bit, then made a delighted noise as though discovering something new. Ephra leaned back against the porch post, scanning the orchard. "Not bad, considering last year's dryness. We might get a decent harvest soon." She turned her attention to Lyanna. "How are your herbs holding up?" "Well enough. I might go foraging tomorrow morning. One of the villagers mentioned a patch of thyme near the rocky outcrop. That's a good place for other things too, if I can find them." Lyanna sipped her water. "If you need more salves for your knees, I can mix something tonight." Ephra smiled in gratitude. "You're a blessing, Elia. I'm sure I speak for the whole hamlet when I say that. We haven't had someone with your knack in a long time." The praise made Lyanna blush. She glanced down at John, who busied himself trying to tip over a wooden bowl on the ground. "I do what I can," she murmured, not trusting her voice to say more. She had grown more accustomed to blending in, but each small kindness from the villagers reminded her how fragile her position was. She wished she could express the full scope of her gratitude, but that would mean revealing far too much. They sat for a while, letting the day drift onward. Then Lyanna gathered John and returned to her cottage for a bit of rest. Afternoon settled in, warmer but not scorching. She opened the shutters, letting in a mild breeze and a wash of sunlight. John napped on the bed, and she carefully sat at the table, sorting the herbal bundles she had in a wicker basket. Each was labeled in her rudimentary code. She ground a few into powder, mixing them with a mortar to create the base for a salve. The repetitive scrape and twist of stone on stone lulled her into a calm state, broken only when John stirred and she needed to rock him back to sleep. The day passed in unremarkable tasks. She visited a neighbor who complained of an upset stomach, gave him a mild tea. She tidied the corners of her cottage, swept out dust. The ordinary nature of these chores soothed her. As dusk approached, she prepared a simple supper, coaxed John into eating mashed vegetables, then stepped outside to breathe in the desert evening. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, the air a blend of warmth and cooling night breeze. She held John against her, walking slowly along the dusty path that traced the edge of the hamlet. Far in the distance, the red mountains caught the dying light, shimmering with an otherworldly glow. She reminded herself that she had found a kind of peace here, however tenuous. She was grateful for every day that passed without conflict. The nights in this desert held a certain hush she had grown to appreciate, an echoing stillness that let her own thoughts settle. In that hush, she could almost believe the realm had moved on from the tumult of rebellion, from the hunts for Targaryen heirs, from the sorrow that once consumed her. She knew it was not so, that such storms only slept. But for now, her life felt steady. In the following week, Lyanna ventured early to the rocky outcrop she'd mentioned to Ephra, leaving John with a kindly neighbor who had volunteered to watch him. She traveled light, just a small leather satchel slung over her shoulder, a water skin, and a pair of shears for cutting stems. Dawn had barely broken when she set out, hoping to beat the heat. Her footsteps stirred the dust as she walked, and she caught glimpses of small desert creatures, a hare darting behind a bush, a lizard perched on a sun-warmed rock. The sky glowed pale orange at the horizon, gradually brightening. The outcrop rose from the desert floor like a sentinel, layered in hues of russet and cream. It provided pockets of shade where tougher herbs could take root. She found the thyme easily enough, pressing her fingers to the tiny leaves and inhaling their pungent scent. She snipped a few bunches, storing them in the satchel. Then she explored further, seeking the succulent with thick, spiny leaves that sometimes grew in crevices. A rare find, but one that made a powerful base for certain remedies. She paused to sip water, scanning the rocky ledges. The sun inched higher, warming her back through her light cloak. She squinted, spotting a hint of green near a cluster of stones. As she approached, she heard a faint noise, a clink of something metallic against rock. Her heart jumped, a sudden flutter of caution. She considered turning back, but it could be nothing more than another forager, or perhaps a traveler resting. She crept forward, mindful of her footsteps, until she glimpsed a tall figure kneeling near a boulder, rummaging through a small pack. The person wore rough traveling clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. An unpleasant jolt of recognition coursed through her. It was the man she'd seen at the spice stall in the larger market town weeks ago, the one whose gaze had unsettled her. She swiftly ducked behind an outcropping, her pulse thrumming. The memory of that moment, how his eyes had lingered on her, rose like a warning cry. She stayed still, controlling her breath, peeking around the rock to see what he was doing. He hadn't noticed her. He appeared to be checking supplies, maybe shifting items around in his pack. There was a small blade at his side, which he set on the ground while he worked. Lyanna swallowed, her mind racing. If he truly recognized her, if he had any suspicion she was Lyanna Stark, rather than Elia Sand, what might he do? But there was no sign he was hunting her specifically. He looked more like a seasoned traveler going about his business. Still, she was unwilling to risk an encounter. She eased back, clinging to the rock's curve, and began the slow retreat, keeping her footsteps light. With each careful step, she tried not to rattle the loose stones underfoot. The sun glared overhead, and sweat beaded on her forehead. She nearly reached the edge of the next slope when her foot slipped, dislodging a small shower of pebbles. They clattered down, echoing in the still air. She froze, heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable. A moment later, she heard the traveler's voice ring out, firm yet not hostile. "Who's there?" He moved around the boulder with swift precision, eyes scanning the rocky ground. Lyanna pressed herself against the stone, breath held. She prayed he would give up, but she knew the desert offered little cover. A second passed, then another. Her mind raced, conjuring excuses. She might be just another gatherer. She could feign ignorance, say she was startled. But if he recognized her features from that day in the market, if he connected the dots, she decided to act before he cornered her. Stepping out, she kept her expression calm and forced a polite smile. "Apologies," she said quietly. "I was gathering herbs and heard noises. I wasn't sure who might be lurking about." He tensed at first, then let out a measured breath, as if relieved. Up close, she noticed he was older than she'd realized, with lines etched at the corners of his eyes. "Ah, so it's you," he replied, his gaze flicking to her satchel. "I saw you at the market some time ago, didn't I? A pale woman with a little boy." Her heart lurched. "That might have been me," she allowed. She made a show of adjusting the satchel strap, as though unconcerned. "I sometimes travel to that market for supplies. I live not far from here." He studied her, his eyes keen. "And what brings you to these rocks so early?" She lifted the shears slightly. "Herbs. Certain plants only grow in the shade here." She tried to hold his gaze without flinching. "I apologize if I startled you." He waved a hand, shifting his weight. "No harm done. Just didn't expect anyone else to be out here. The desert's wide after all." He paused, then gave a slight tilt of his head. "I'm called Andros, by the way. I've been traveling around Dorne. Got some business in Sunspear, but I like to wander." She offered a curt nod. "I'm Elia Sand." "Elia Sand," he repeated, as though tasting the words. There was a moment, fleeting, where his eyes narrowed. "You're not Dornish-born though, are you?" She forced a shrug, feigning a casual tone. "My mother was. I traveled a lot growing up. Ended up here." He seemed to accept that, though the curiosity in his gaze did not fade. "Well, I won't keep you from your herb gathering. Good fortune to you, and watch your step. The desert's full of hidden corners." "Nenyo." She inclined her head, relieved he didn't press the matter. "And to you, as well." With that, she turned and headed back toward the hamlet, forcing her steps to remain even and unhurried, despite the hammering of her pulse. The moment she was out of sight, she let her breath spill out in a shaky exhale. Her mind reeled with the possibilities. Had he recognized her from the market, because he was simply observant, or was there more? She had seen no open threat in him, only a guarded curiosity. But that alone was enough to send a chill through her. She wondered if he might wander into the hamlet next, ask around, learn about Elia Sand, who lived with her baby boy. Her cover story was strong enough. Everyone believed it. Still, she dreaded the unpredictability of strangers with too many questions. The walk home felt twice as long as the walk out. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Andros following at a distance, but she saw no sign of him. By the time she reached the edge of the hamlet, the sun stood high and bright, and her clothes clung to her skin with sweat. She paused to gather herself, wiping her brow. A couple of villagers greeted her, oblivious to her inner turmoil. She forced a smile and returned the greeting. Then she headed straight for the house of the neighbor watching John, collected her son with hurried thanks, and retreated to her cottage. Inside, she closed the door, barring it out of habit. She pressed her forehead against the rough wood, listening to John's delighted babble as he recognized her. She turned, scooping him into her arms. He wriggled, full of energy. She held him tightly, absorbing his warmth, his innocence, letting it quell the storm in her mind. No matter what lingered outside, she reminded herself she had survived so much already. A mere stranger wouldn't undo her, so long as she remained careful. She settled John on a cushion, watching him gnaw at a wooden toy. He had begun teething in earnest, chewing on anything he could get his hands on. That thought reminded her to check his gums for swelling, and she gently pressed a fingertip along his bottom gum. He squirmed but didn't cry. She smiled at him. "Soon enough, I'll be chasing you around, trying to keep you from biting on everything," she said softly. He blinked up at her, drool trailing down his chin. To steady herself, she went about the rest of her day as calmly as she could. She sorted the herbs she'd gathered. Less than she had hoped for, since the unexpected encounter had cut her trip short. She managed to find a patch of thyme and a small bag of the succulent leaves she needed, but not the quantity she'd wanted. Still, she counted it a success that she'd emerged from the meeting with Andros unscathed. By late afternoon, she forced herself out to the well, greeting villagers as if nothing was amiss. She drew water, answered a few idle questions about her foraging trip, and made sure to maintain a polite, open demeanor, the mask she wore so well. No one in the hamlet suspected she was a highborn woman once at the center of war. That secret must hold. That night, she struggled to sleep. She lay on her back, John curled near her. The small window overhead allowed a sliver of moonlight. She watched the faint glow dance across the ceiling, thinking of the man named Andros. He had not threatened her. He had not demanded answers. Yet something in his steady gaze unnerved her, as though he was the sort who noticed details others missed. She wondered if he might speak of the fair-skinned woman he'd encountered to a friend or passing guard. If a rumor might find its way into the wrong ears. The fear was relentless. She tried to tell herself that many women in Dorne had varying features, that not every foreigner was a risk. But the uneasy flutter in her chest refused to die down. Days slipped by, and no sign of Andros appeared in the hamlet. No whispered gossip suggested a traveler had come asking about her. Lyanna began to relax again, though her guard never fell completely. She continued her routine, early mornings at the well, chores, mixing remedies, strolling with Jon around the orchard. The villagers carried on as they always had. Ephra asked her to keep an eye on an older man who complained of dizziness. Lyanna busied herself preparing teas with a mild stimulant effect, hopeful it might help. Jon's second name day approached. Lyanna realized it had nearly been 2 full years since his birth, since she fled the Tower of Joy alive, when all the realm believed her dead. 2 years of quiet exile, 2 years of motherhood, 2 years of a peace she clutched like a lifeline. She wanted to mark the occasion for Jon's sake, even if he was too young to understand. So she went to Ephra, shyly asking if she might buy a small sweet cake from the traveling baker who sometimes came through. Ephra grinned at the suggestion. "Of course," he said, delighted. "We'll make it a little festival for him, with the other children. He's such a darling boy." A few days later, the baker arrived with his donkey cart of wares, and Lyanna purchased a tiny round cake sweetened with honey. She kept it hidden on her table, covered with a cloth. Then, as dusk approached, she gathered a small circle of neighbors, Ephra, Marina, Quent, and a few curious children. Jon, blinking in surprise at the fuss, toddled around as the villagers presented him with small trinkets. A carved wooden horse, a cloth ball, and a few lumps of dried fruit. He babbled in confusion, though he grinned when the children tried to include him in a chasing game. Lyanna watched with a swelling heart, thankful for these unpretentious gestures. It wasn't a lavish feast in a great hall. It was better. It was safe and real. They lit a single candle on the little honey cake, shielding it from the mild breeze. Lyanna knelt beside Jon, gently guiding his hand near the candle's glow. "Make a wish, my boy," she murmured, though she knew he couldn't grasp the tradition yet. He only poked at the flickering flame, causing Ephra to laugh and whisk it away before he could burn himself. Then she helped him blow it out, or rather, she pretended to blow while he squealed at the puff of air. In that moment, Lyanna felt tears prick her eyes. She thought of Rhaegar, of how he would have wanted to celebrate his son's life, perhaps with music and poems. She swallowed hard, pushing the thought away. This was enough, more than she had hoped for. The neighbors lingered just long enough to sample slices of the honey cake, which was small but rich in flavor. Jon smeared sticky crumbs on his cheeks, and the children teased him gently until Ephra scolded them, reminding them Jon was just a baby. Lyanna smiled through it all, the warmth of their kindness enveloping her. Soon the villagers drifted back to their own homes, lamps bobbing in the twilight. Ephra stayed a moment longer, patting Lyanna's shoulder. "Happy day, dear. He's a good lad. Keep loving him like you do." Lyanna managed to whisper a thank you before the older woman departed. In the silence that followed, Lyanna took a damp cloth to clean Jon's sticky face, balancing him on her lap. He fussed at first, then giggled as she wiped his chubby cheeks. Once done, she cradled him, rocking back and forth in the dim lamplight. Outside, the desert hush wrapped the hamlet in a gentle stillness. She pressed her lips to his forehead. "You're growing so fast," she murmured. "I hope someday you'll understand why we live like this. But for now, just be my sweet boy, all right?" He yawned, drooping against her. She carried him to their bed, and he fell asleep easily, lulled by the day's excitement. Later, as she lay awake, her mind drifted to her own family, wondering what they might think if they could see Jon now. Ned would love him, she felt sure. Caitlin might have offered him a mother's care in Winterfell, had circumstances been different. Her father was gone, her brother Brandon too, and that thought still stung like an old wound. But at least Ned was alive, guarding the north. She prayed he was well, that he was able to keep Robert's anger and suspicion turned away from any rumors of hidden Targaryens. She prayed the new king had truly laid the past to rest as best he could. Some nights, she wondered if Robert visited her tomb in the crypts at Winterfell. An empty tomb, a lie enshrined in stone. The next morning, life resumed its gentle pace. Lyanna rose before dawn, rocking Jon awake with quiet hushes. After feeding him a bit of mashed fruit, she made her way to the orchard to help Ephra, who grumbled about pests nibbling at her saplings. Jon scampered around, occasionally tripping over uneven ground. Each time Lyanna hurried to him, checking for scratches. He rarely cried, just picked himself up or extended his arms for her help. She marveled at his resilience, both proud and frightened at how quickly he gained independence. Around midday, when the sun climbed overhead, they retreated to the shade of the cottage, where Lyanna shared a meal of bread and cheese with Jon on her lap. Afterward, she sang a soft lullaby, coaxing him to rest for a brief nap. Though the day was warm, a mild breeze drifted through the shutters, making the quiet interior of the cottage almost cozy. She tidied the room, careful not to disturb Jon, and found herself reflecting again on the sense of home she built here. It was bare bones. A single room with minimal furnishings, floors of compacted earth, walls that had needed patching more than once, yet it housed so much comfort. She thought of how Winterfell's halls were made of stone. How, as a girl, she used to wander them with an air of restless energy. Now, the simplicity of this desert cottage was all she needed, so long as Jon was safe within it. The days edged into weeks. Jon's new teeth came in, causing him some discomfort that made him whine, especially at night. Lyanna tried everything: honey water on a cloth to chew, gentle herbal teas, soothing lullabies. Sometimes he'd cry fitfully until exhaustion overcame him. Still, each morning he was up again, tottering around as though nothing had happened. Lyanna found herself exhausted by the nighttime struggles, but she soldiered on, relying on short midday naps and the occasional help from Ephra or Marina. A small carnival of sorts arrived in the hamlet one afternoon. 2 men and a woman with a pair of dancing dogs, a battered harp, and a battered wagon. They set up near the well, enticed the villagers with promises of music, dancing, and jokes. Though small, their act was enough to draw everyone together for an evening of merriment. Lyanna watched from the fringes, Jon perched on her hip, enthralled by the dogs that hopped on hind legs to a jaunty tune from the harp. People clapped and cheered, coins clinked into a little bowl. The carnival folk later sold candied nuts, which Lyanna bought for Jon to taste. He bit into one, pulled a face at the intense sweetness, and then demanded another. She laughed softly, wiping sticky residue from his lips. For a moment, she let herself get swept up in the charm of the performance, forgetting her worries. The woman in the carnival winked at Jon, calling him the little prince. Lyanna froze momentarily at those words, an innocent remark, but it struck her heart like a hammer. She forced a smile, hoping no one noticed her sudden tension. The carnival woman bowed theatrically and moved on to entertain the older children. That night, after the carnival folk had packed up and rolled their wagon away, the villagers slowly dispersed. Lyanna lingered by the well, letting Jon watch the moonlight sparkle on the water's surface. She felt something shift in the air, a crispness that hinted at cooler weather to come. Winters in Dorne were mild, but there was still a shift in temperature that promised easier working days and more comfortable nights. Yet she was reminded that time kept moving, that Jon was growing, that her own future was drifting on. She wondered how long she could keep him hidden here without him starting to question who he truly was. Not that he would have the words to ask just yet, but soon enough, he'd be old enough for bigger questions. He'd noticed the villagers had different parentage stories, different family structures. He might question where his father was, or why his mother never spoke of her past. She knew the time would come, and she dreaded it, though she told herself she'd cross that bridge when it arrived. For now, he was only 2, learning to talk in short phrases, learning to run. She had time. Near midnight, she carried him back to the cottage. He dozed off on her shoulder, lulled by the hush of the desert. She tucked him into their shared bed, then lay awake a while, listening to the faint sounds of the wind outside. She thought of the caramel woman's stray words, "Little prince," and felt a stirring of old pain. Jon had a claim he would never proclaim, an inheritance that could topple kings. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent vow to never let him become a pawn in the realm's endless power struggles. The vow burned in her, steeling her resolve. A few days later, she heard mention from Quent that travelers heading to Sunspear had passed through. She tensed at the news, half expecting Andros' name to arise. But Quent only shrugged, saying it was a group of merchants. Nothing unusual. Lyanna nodded, relieved, though she knew Andros could just as easily slip through without mention. She tried to dismiss it from her thoughts. If he hadn't come looking for her by now, perhaps he never would. Even so, she found herself more watchful than before, scanning the edges of the village each morning, occasionally climbing the low ridge behind her cottage to survey the desert. She saw nothing but the usual dunes and cacti. In that time, she continued building a reputation as a reliable herbalist. One neighbor with persistent joint pain came to her for a balm. Another with a rash needed a soothing salve. She was happy to help. It gave her a purpose she found deeply satisfying, a way to repay the hamlet's acceptance of her. Now and then, she wished she had the resources of a maester's library, a wealth of knowledge that might let her do more than just treat simple ailments. But the small knowledge she possessed was enough for this place. Perhaps too much knowledge would only draw more questions. One morning, Ephra appeared at Lyanna's door, breathless. "Ilya, can you come quickly? Carlin's boy took a bad fall." Lyanna's pulse skipped. She scooped up her satchel of supplies and hurried after Ephra toward Carlin's cottage. Inside, she found the boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, lying on a pallet, tears streaking his dusty cheeks. He was conscious but clearly in pain, holding his arm which looked twisted at an odd angle. Lyanna knelt, calming the boy with gentle words. She asked Carlin for a strip of cloth and 2 sticks to fashion a splint. While Carlin fetched them, she examined the boy's arm, wincing at the unnatural angle. "It might be broken," she said softly. "We'll splint it and keep him still until the bone can heal. I'll give him something for the pain." Carlin, a tall man with worry etched on his face, nodded, grateful for her knowledge. "Thank the 7 you're here," he muttered, watching as Lyanna bound the makeshift splint with steady hands. The boy whimpered, tears welling anew. She soothed him, promising it would help him feel better soon. Then she brewed a quick tea from a dried poppy mixture, mild enough not to harm him, but potent enough to dull the worst of the pain. By the time she finished, the boy's eyes drooped, exhaustion and the effects of the tea dragging him toward sleep. Lyanna slipped outside, letting Carlin cradle his son. Ephra joined her, patting her back. "Bless you, Elia," she said. "You did well in there." Lyanna took a moment to breathe, relief mingling with the old pang of grief that always lurked near. She had seen enough violence in her time, enough bloodshed. And while this was only a child's fracture, the memory of men dying for her sake still haunted her. If only life's injuries could be so easily mended. "I'm glad to help," she said simply. Carlin emerged, face lined with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough," he said, voice unsteady. "I don't have coin, but I'll gather some eggs and a bit of goat milk for you." "That's not necessary," Lyanna replied. "Truly. I only want to see him heal." He shook his head firmly. "No, you deserve something for your kindness. I'll bring it by your cottage soon." "Neil." She nodded, touched by his earnestness. Then Ephra led her away, leaving Carlin to tend his son. They walked in companionable silence for a while. The day's heat had begun to rise, and Lyanna squinted at the sun's glare. She found her thoughts drifting. Each time she aided someone, she intertwined herself more deeply with the life of this hamlet. She built a place here, one that people counted on. That closeness brought comfort, yet also risk. She hoped no one from outside would come prying into the business of this village, no one who might tear away the fragile normalcy she had found. By midday, she returned home, arms weary, mind restless. John was playing in the courtyard under Marina's watchful eye. He trotted to her with a wide grin as she approached. She knelt to catch him, lifting him into a hug, inhaling the faint warm scent of his hair. He pointed at her satchel, babbling some question she couldn't quite decipher. She chuckled. "That's for helping people, my sweet. Maybe someday I'll teach you how." "Man." He studied her face as though trying to understand every word. She ruffled his dark curls and carried him inside. The day wore on in simple tasks, cooking, cleaning, comforting John through his fussiness, then venturing out to gather some water. That night, she lay awake again, thinking of the boy's broken arm, of how quickly life could change. One slip, one tumble, and a bone fractured. One misstep in her lies, and her entire world might crumble. She stroked Jon's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She promised herself she would remain vigilant, no matter how tedious it felt to be on constant guard. A few weeks later, Carlin's boy was well on his way to healing, the splint still in place, the father offering daily thanks to Lyanna. She accepted his gratitude gracefully, though in truth she was just relieved the boy hadn't needed more serious treatment. A traveling merchant brought news of bandit sightings near the Prince's Pass, but none ventured this deep into the desert. Lyanna continued her rhythms, gathering herbs, caring for John, mixing remedies. Each day blended into the next, the sun rising and setting on a life that, if not perfectly safe, at least felt manageable. Then one late afternoon, as she was returning from the orchard with a small basket of figs, she saw a horse at Ephra's gate, a stranger's horse, sleek and dark, with a saddlebag bearing some unknown sigil. Her pulse rose. She approached cautiously, adjusting the basket on her hip. The cottage door was open, and inside she heard voices, Ephra's and a man's, low and indistinct. Lyanna hesitated, considering if she should retreat. But she was tired of cowering. She forced herself to step to the threshold and peek in. Ephra stood near the fireplace, arms folded. Opposite her was a lean man in travel-stained clothing, older, with short-cropped hair gone partially gray. He turned at Lyanna's approach, and she recognized him as Sir Arwood, the knight with the scar, the one who had questioned her months ago when the Yarnwood soldiers came searching for outlaws. Immediately, her stomach twisted. He shouldn't be here, she thought. They had moved on. Why would he return? His scarred face curled into a tight smile. "Ah, I remember you," he said quietly. "Elias Sand, wasn't it?" "The herbalist." She swallowed, setting the basket aside on a small table. "Sir Arwood, you've returned. May I ask why?" Ephra cast Lyanna a concerned glance. "He's come looking for someone," she said tersely. "Says it's official business." Sir Arwood inclined his head. "Indeed. I'm passing through on my way to Yarnwood lands again. We've had further trouble with the same bandits. Some rumors suggest they've hidden in local hamlets. I'm simply verifying that all is well here." His dark eyes flicked from Ephra to Lyanna. "No need for alarm. But if any strange folk have come by, we want to know." "Dorne?" Lyanna's breath hitched. The memory of Andros flashed in her mind, but she kept her face neutral. "I've seen no outlaws," she said truthfully. "Just the usual travelers." Sir Arwood studied her for a moment, as though weighing her words. Then he nodded. "Good. And how is your child?" His tone was casual, but it felt like a test. "Growing strong, I trust?" She clamped down on the fear roiling in her gut, and forced a light smile. "He is. Running around like a little whirlwind." Ephra cleared her throat. "If that's all, sir, we'd be grateful if you let us return to our tasks. The orchard needs tending, and Elia has remedies to prepare." He gave a polite bow of the head. "Certainly. Forgive the intrusion. I'll be moving on soon anyway." As he turned to go, he paused at the door, glancing back at Lyanna tight. "If you hear anything about suspicious strangers, be sure to inform the local guard or the next patrol of Yarnwood men. We want no trouble in these parts." She dipped her head in acknowledgement. "Understood." He stepped outside. Moments later, she heard the snort of his horse and the clatter of hooves on the dusty ground. She and Ephra exchanged tense looks. Ephra pursed her lips, "That man unsettles me," the older woman said. "He keeps sniffing around, never quite satisfied. I hope he rides off for good." Lyanna tried to steady her voice. "I'm sure he will. There's nothing for him here." She forced a faint laugh. "Unless he enjoys orchard chores." Ephra shook her head but smiled wryly at the joke. "Let's hope not." She ushered Lyanna out. "Go on home, child. It's nearly evening." Lyanna picked up the basket and left, heart hammering with old fears. The mere sight of Sir Arwood reminded her how thin her protective veil was, how easily circumstances might shift if he grew curious or suspicious again. That evening, she kept John indoors, refusing the neighbor children's invitation to play. She claimed he was tired, though in truth she wanted to ensure no prying eyes lingered on her family. She fed him a simple supper, then soothed him with a lullaby when he fussed. Outside, the day faded into a swath of bruised purple sky. She let the shutters remain half closed, the lamplight inside flickering across the walls. Once John was asleep, she sat quietly at the table, head in her hands, remembering every detail of her conversation with Sir Arwood, trying to gauge if he suspected anything. Probably not, she told herself. He was investigating bandits. He had no reason to link her to anything else. Yet logic did little to quell the dread simmering in her veins. She forced herself to breathe slowly, focusing on the life she'd built here. She had endured all manner of near discoveries over the past 2 years. The Yarnwood nights had come and gone before without learning anything. She had fended off the watchful stares of strangers. Her story held up. The villagers would vouch for her as Elia Sand, the mild-mannered widow with a knack for healing. But she also couldn't deny that the night's reappearance rattled her, especially after her encounter with Andros. The world outside didn't forget so easily. She wondered how many times she could gamble on luck. At dawn, she rose and went about her routine, mindful that Sir Arwood might still be in the vicinity. She saw no sign of him. The villagers offered no news of additional soldiers. Perhaps he truly had moved on. She decided to remain cautious, limiting her excursions beyond the hamlet for a time. Ephra asked if she still planned on gathering certain herbs in the hills, and she shook her head. "Not now. I'll wait until we're sure the roads are safe. I have enough supplies for a while." Days passed without incident. She breathed easier, though the memory of his visit lingered. She poured her energy into caring for John, who demanded more attention each day. He picked up words more rapidly now. "Water, sky, no, mine." She coaxed him gently toward stringing 2 words together, delighting when he managed something resembling "Mama come" or "Bird up." His curiosity was boundless, and he explored their cottage with determination, pulling open baskets and scattering items across the floor. She let him roam, only intervening when he threatened to topple the water jug or chew on something dangerous. Meanwhile, life in the hamlet settled back into the comfortable lull she'd come to know. Neighbors greeted her kindly, joked about how quickly John was growing. A traveling fisherman sold salted trout in the courtyard, a small rarity this far inland. Lyanna purchased a little, figuring it would be a treat. Quent repaired his cart again, hoping to take goods to a nearby town before the weather shifted to winter's mild chill. Ephra muttered about the orchard's future, always caught between hope and exasperation. Days meandered like a slow river, each one uneventful yet precious. In the hush of evening, Lyanna sometimes found herself sitting outside with John, letting him toddle at her feet. She would watch the desert sky bleed from pale blue into dusty rose as the sun set. On one such evening, she noticed John paused, pointing at the horizon with an excited cry. At first, she thought he'd seen a bird or perhaps the silhouette of a distant traveler. But as she followed his gesture, she spotted a single star emerging in the twilight, bright enough to catch his eye. He pointed again, words tumbling from his mouth, garbled but urgent. She sank to her knees beside him, guiding his hand toward that pinprick of light. "Yes, that's a star," she said softly. "Just one of many." He stared, mouth slightly open. She felt a sudden, aching tenderness bloom in her chest. This was the wonder she wanted for him. A life where he could marvel at stars instead of fleeing from shadows of old wars. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her cheek against his fine hair. "We're safe here," she whispered, "and I'll keep it that way." He nestled into her embrace, content. She held him like that for a long time, until darkness deepened and the hush of night enveloped the hamlet. Eventually, she carried him inside, laid him down on their bed, and watched his eyes flutter closed. In the flickering lamplight, she traced her fingertips over his brow, cherishing the innocence that shaped his tiny features. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future unburdened by the realm's politics. Perhaps, if they simply continued as they were, the ghosts of her past would never find them. But she had learned the world was rarely so simple. Even in Dorne's remotest villages, rumor and suspicion could flourish like hardy desert flowers. She thought of Sir Arwood, of Andros, of the countless other nameless threats that might cross her path. Yet as she watched Jon sleep, she felt her resolve solidify anew. She would do whatever it took to protect him. She had chosen this path 2 years ago, and she would walk it without wavering. If ever danger loomed, she would fight, she would flee, she would vanish into the sands if needed. But until that day came, she clung to every moment of peace, of normalcy, savoring them like sweet drops of water in the desert. Night settled in, and the desert's stillness grew absolute. The lamp's flame danced, painting shadows on the walls. Lyanna lay down beside Jon, letting her hand rest lightly on his small back, feeling the gentle rise and fall. Tomorrow would bring more chores, more daily tasks, more watchful gazes. But for now, she had this fragile sanctuary. The hush of the stars overhead, the warmth of her son's body close to hers. She closed her eyes and let sleep wash away the tension, trusting that for one more night, at least, the secrets of Lyanna Stark remained safe in the quiet corners of Dorne.